Before we dive into one of the most dramatic reversals in World War II armor development, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now, smash that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Are you in the United States? Germany? Somewhere else entirely? I want to know. December 20th, 1944. The snow-covered fields near Werbeumont, Belgium. Through the morning fog, a column of M36 tank destroyers from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion rolled forward, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division. Their crews were exhausted, cold, and terrified. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the white landscape, German Panther tanks prowled, steel predators with frontal armor so thick that standard American guns bounced shells off them like pebbles. But these M36s were different. They carried something special. Something the Army brass had said they'd never need. A 90mm gun that could punch through 221mm of armor at 500 yards. The Germans were about to learn a terrible lesson about American ingenuity. To understand why the 90mm gun mattered so desperately, you need to grasp the nightmare American tank crews faced in late 1944. When American forces stormed ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, they discovered a horrifying reality. 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers, heavily armored medium tanks whose frontal plates could not be penetrated by the standard 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman at any practical combat range. The 75mm Sherman gun could manage penetration only from 400 to 2,600 meters against the Panther's sides, but head-on? Nothing. Zero penetration. American tankers gave their Shermans dark nicknames. The Ronson Burner, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." The Germans called them Tommy Cookers. A post-war report found that 60 to 90% of Sherman tanks were destroyed by fire. The crews knew the brutal mathematics. It took 5 Shermans to reliably kill 1 Panther, and 4 of those Shermans wouldn't be going home. The human cost was staggering. Tank crews climbed into their Shermans each morning not knowing if that day they'd meet a Panther or Tiger they couldn't hurt. The psychological weight crushed morale. By March 1945, there were memos circulating about critically low morale among Sherman crews. The 90mm gun represented hope. It was the one weapon that could fight German heavy armor on something approaching equal terms. But getting that gun to the battlefield would require overcoming something even more dangerous than enemy fire: institutional resistance, bureaucratic inertia, and the stubborn certainty of American military leadership that such a weapon simply wasn't necessary. The story begins not in 1944, but in 1942, in the burning sands of North Africa. When American forces first engaged German armor in Tunisia during Operation Torch, they carried confidence bordering on arrogance. The M4 Sherman was hailed as a triumph of American engineering, reliable, fast, with excellent gun stabilization and good crew comfort. General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, believed the Sherman represented the perfect balance of mobility, dependability, speed, protection, and firepower. McNair championed what became known as tank destroyer doctrine. In his vision, tanks existed to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and avoid tank versus tank battles. Enemy tanks would be engaged by specialized tank destroyer forces, lightly armored but fast vehicles mounting powerful anti-tank guns, supplemented by towed artillery pieces. This doctrine made sense on paper. It conserved resources, avoided the weight and logistical penalties of heavy armor, and played to American strengths in industrial production and tactical mobility. The M10 tank destroyer, mounting a 3-inch gun, seemed adequate for the mission. Early engagements in North Africa and Sicily appeared to confirm these assumptions. Panthers weren't encountered. The Tiger I appeared in tiny numbers and suffered mechanical breakdowns. American tankers faced mostly Panzer IIIs and IVs, which the Sherman could handle at normal combat ranges. But intelligence was painting a different picture, one that leadership chose to downplay. The Soviets had been screaming warnings about the Panther since its introduction on the Eastern Front in mid-1943. They provided technical specifications, captured examples, and urgent assessments of its capabilities. The British, scarred by falling behind in the tank race during North Africa, took these warnings seriously and began developing countermeasures. They created the Sherman Firefly by mounting their excellent 17-pounder gun in a Sherman turret, a modification that gave them 340 Fireflies by D-Day. The Americans. They dismissed the threat. U.S. Army intelligence concluded the Panther would be a heavy tank like the Tiger, produced in limited numbers, not worth redesigning American armor to counter. One assessment in 1943 stated, "The M4 tank has been hailed widely as the best tank of the battlefield today. There appears to be no fear on the part of our forces of the German Mark VI Tiger tank. There can be no basis for the T-26 tank other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel, which is believed to be unsound and unnecessary." Meanwhile, American ordnance engineers weren't sitting idle. They understood physics and metallurgy. They knew the 3-inch gun on the M10 was becoming obsolete. In late summer 1942, as the M10 entered production, the Ordnance Department began examining the potential of a new tank destroyer armed with a 90mm gun. The 90mm had an interesting pedigree. It started life as the M1 anti-aircraft gun, America's answer to the German 88mm flak, which the Germans had discovered worked beautifully as an anti-tank weapon. The American 90mm could fire a 3.5-inch shell to altitudes of 43,500 feet or distances of 62,474 feet horizontally. It was a monster of a gun, designed to bring down high-altitude bombers. But could it be adapted to kill tanks? In October 1942, the Ordnance Department tested mounting an experimental 90mm gun, designated the T7, into the turret of an M10 tank destroyer. The concept was sound, but the execution proved challenging. The 90mm gun was simply too heavy for the M10's turret design. It unbalanced the traverse mechanism and required a complete turret redesign. A prototype designated the T-53 gun motor carriage was rushed into development in August 1942, with plans to immediately produce 500 vehicles. But the tank destroyer force, led by General Andrew Bruce, objected strenuously. The design was too rushed, they argued. The problems weren't solved. The contract was cancelled. Thus began a bureaucratic battle that would cost thousands of American lives. June 6, 1944. D-Day. American forces poured onto the beaches of Normandy carrying the hopes of the free world. Every M4 Sherman that rolled off those landing craft mounted the 75mm gun. Not one carried the 76mm upgrade that had been developed. Not one carried anything that could reliably penetrate a Panther from the front. Within hours of the first contact with German armor, the reports started flooding back. And they were horrifying. Lieutenant Robert Boscawen of the British 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry recorded his shock at first encountering Panthers. The Sherman was no match for the German tanks in a straight fight. They would see you first, shoot first, and kill you first. An American tanker from the 3rd Armored Division wrote in his diary, "A Panther can hit us from a mile away and we can't do a damn thing about it. We have to get within 200 yards to have a chance at the sides." 200 yards. That's suicide range. The mathematics of tank combat became brutally clear. The Panther mounted a 75mm KWK-42L/70 gun, a high-velocity weapon with exceptional armor penetration. Its frontal armor measured 80mm on the glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it effective thickness of over 140mm. The Sherman's 75mm could not penetrate this armor at any range. The Sherman's own frontal armor, in contrast, was only 51mm. The Panther could kill a Sherman at 3,500 yards. The Sherman had to close to point-blank range and hope for a side shot. Crew after crew climbed into their Shermans knowing the odds. Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole, who became the top American tank ace, described the standard tactic: you needed 5 Shermans to knock out 1 Panther. 1 Sherman would maneuver around front to get the Panther's attention while the other 4 worked around the flanks. Usually, the decoy died. Poole's voice was matter-of-fact when he said it, but the weight of those words, "usually the decoy died," carried the grief of watching friends burn. And they did burn. The Sherman had a critical vulnerability. Its ammunition was stored in sponsons along the sides of the hull. When a German shell penetrated, it often detonated this ammunition, and the resulting explosion sent a gout of flame through the crew compartment. Tankers had perhaps 5 seconds to get out before they burned alive. British research concluded that a Sherman would be set alight 82% of the time after an average of 1.89 armor penetrations. Veteran tank crews developed superstitions and modifications trying to increase their odds. Some welded extra track links onto their tank's front for additional armor. It rarely helped. Others stacked sandbags, which proved almost useless and made the tank top-heavy. Crews learned to spot the telltale muzzle flash of an 88mm or the distinctive profile of a Panther's hull and immediately reverse, pop smoke, and pray. The psychological toll was immense. Combat exhaustion rates among tank crews spiked. Men who had survived months of combat began refusing to mount up. Company commanders sometimes had to rotate crews forcibly to prevent complete psychological breakdown. The knowledge that you were outgunned, out-armored, and that survival often depended on luck rather than skill corroded the soul. By July 1944, the situation had become so critical that it triggered what historians call the tank panic. Field commanders were sending increasingly desperate messages up the chain. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, commanding U.S. forces in a European theater, had been requesting better-armed tanks since 1943. In November 1943, he specifically requested 250 T-26E1 tanks, the prototype that would become the M26 Pershing, mounting 90mm guns. He wanted them distributed at a ratio of 1 T-26 for every 5 Shermans. McNair refused. He wrote to Devers, "There is no indication that the 76mm anti-tank gun is inadequate against the German Mark VI Tiger tank." This assessment came even as field reports documented the 76mm struggles against the much more common Panther. The 76mm gun was finally being mounted in upgraded Shermans, but it provided only marginal improvement. Against a Panther's frontal armor, the 76mm could penetrate only with special HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, tungsten rounds, and those were in desperately short supply. Standard ammunition still bounced off. Meanwhile, the redesigned M36 tank destroyer project, mounting the 90mm gun in a newly designed turret on an M10 chassis, crawled through development. The prototypes, designated T-71, were completed in September 1943. Initial requests for production were denied because, as stated in military documents, 90mm guns were already being studied for use on tanks. This circular logic trapped the program in bureaucratic limbo. General Andrew Bruce, head of the tank destroyer force, preferred the lighter, faster M18 Hellcat, but that mounted only a 76mm gun, the same inadequate weapon. Bruce's objections were ultimately overridden, and Army ground forces approved the M36 project in October 1943. Testing began, and dragged on, and on. The first 40 minutes and 36 seconds weren't shipped overseas until September 1944, 3 months after D-Day. They entered combat in October 1944. By then, thousands of American tankers had already paid the price for that delay with their lives. The 90mm M3 gun was born from desperation, engineering brilliance, and the stubborn refusal of ordnance officers to accept that American tankers should die for bureaucratic convenience. The weapon's development required solving a cascade of technical challenges. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, the starting point, was designed for a fixed mounting or a wheeled carriage. It could be depressed to engage ground targets, but not low enough for effective tank warfare from a turret. In May 1943, the Army standardized the M2 variant, modified with dual-purpose capabilities for both anti-aircraft and anti-tank use, allowing depression to 10 degrees below horizontal. But mounting this weapon in a fighting vehicle required further modifications. The tank-mounted variant, designated the 90mm M3, was tested on an M10 tank destroyer chassis in early 1943. Engineers immediately discovered the problems. The gun was simply too heavy. The barrel alone protruded dangerously far forward, affecting the vehicle's balance and making transport difficult. The original M10 turret couldn't handle the weight or the recoil forces. The turret would need to be completely redesigned. The solution was elegant but time-consuming. The new turret featured curved sides rather than the M10's angular design, reducing the number of parts while improving ballistic properties. The critical innovation was a massive cast counterweight welded to the rear of the turret, creating the distinctive bustle that would characterize the M36. This counterweight served triple duty. It balanced the heavy gun, provided storage for 11 rounds of ammunition, and mounted a pedestal for a .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun. The turret incorporated powered traverse, a significant upgrade over the M10's manual system, driven by hydraulic motors. This allowed the gunner to track moving targets more effectively, critical when engaging fast-moving panzers. The sides were made of rolled armor plate 1.25 inches thick, not enough to stop a Panther's gun, but adequate protection against most medium-caliber weapons. The rounded cast gun shield measured 3 inches thick. The turret remained open-topped, a controversial design choice that drew criticism. But it served multiple purposes: reduced overall weight, better observation for the commander, improved crew communication, and, vitally, provided an escape route if the vehicle was hit. Given how often fighting vehicles burned, that last consideration saved lives. The 90mm M3 gun itself was a fearsome weapon. It had a bore diameter of 3.5 inches and a barrel length of 15 feet, 50 calibers. Muzzle velocity with standard M82 armor-piercing capped APC ammunition was 2,650 feet per second. This gave it penetration of 129 millimeters of armor angled at 30 degrees from vertical at 500 yards, and 122 millimeters at 1,000 yards. But the real breakthrough came with specialized ammunition. The T-30E16 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, round used a tungsten carbide subcaliber penetrator in a discarding sabot. This increased muzzle velocity dramatically and focused the kinetic energy on a smaller impact area. With HVAP ammunition, the 90mm could penetrate 221 mm of armor at 500 yards and 199 mm at 1,000 yards, performance comparable to the German 88mm KWK 43L/71 gun mounted on the Tiger II. Accuracy was exceptional. Testing showed that with HVAP ammunition, the 90mm M3 had less dispersion than the famous German 88mm, both vertically and horizontally. The extreme vertical deviation dropped from 70 inches to 30 inches, and horizontal dispersion from 41 inches to 17 inches. American gunners could reliably hit targets at extreme range. Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion would prove this in combat, scoring a kill against a Panther at 4,600 yards, 4,200 meters, the maximum range of the M36 telescopic sight. This remains one of the longest-range tank kills recorded in World War II. The M36 carried 47 rounds of main ammunition. 5 types were available: the M82 APC for general anti-tank work, the M93 HVAP for heavy armor, M71 high explosive for soft targets and infantry, M304 armor-piercing composite rigid APCR, and M313 smoke rounds. This versatility made the M36 effective against a wide range of targets, not just enemy armor. The vehicle itself used the hull of the M10A1 tank destroyer, which employed the reliable M4 Sherman chassis and drivetrain. Power came from the Ford GAA V8 engine, an 18-liter behemoth producing 500 horsepower. This gave the 29-ton M36 a road speed of 26 miles per hour, not as fast as the M18 Hellcat's 55 miles per hour, but adequate for tactical repositioning. Range was 150 miles, sufficient for sustained operations. The crew consisted of 5 men: driver, assistant driver, gunner, loader, and commander. The driver sat in the front left hull position with limited visibility through periscopes. The assistant driver, in the front right, also served as bow machine gunner, though the M36, unlike conventional tanks, had no bow machine gun. His role was primarily to assist with navigation and serve as a relief driver. The gun crew worked in the turret. The commander, standing at the right rear, had the best observation position and controlled engagement decisions. The gunner, seated at the right front of the turret, operated the main gun using the M76F telescope, a sophisticated optical sight with range graduations. The loader, on the left, had perhaps the most physically demanding job, manhandling 42-pound shells from storage racks and ramming them into the breech while the vehicle bounced over rough terrain and incoming fire hammered the thin armor. Production proved almost as challenging as development. The initial plan called for converting M10A1 hulls, the variant using the M4A3's Ford engine, into M36S by replacing the turret. Between June and December 1944, multiple factories tackled the work. Massey Harris converted 500, American Locomotive Company converted 413, and Grand Blanc produced 300 new-build M36S from April to July 1944. But demand rapidly outstripped supply. As the need became critical in late 1944, production was expanded in creative ways. The M36B1 variant mounted the M36 turret on standard M4A3 Sherman hulls. 187 were built between October and December 1944. The M36B2 used M10 hulls with diesel engines. 724 were converted beginning in May 1945. Still, numbers remained inadequate. By December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted, only about 400 minutes and 36 seconds were available in the European theater. 7 tank destroyer battalions had converted to the new vehicle by year's end. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The first crews to receive M36s treated them with an almost religious reverence. After months of facing German armor with weapons that couldn't fight back, they finally had teeth. Sergeant William C. Chase of the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the first units to receive the M36 in September 1944, wrote home, "We got the new TDs today. Big 90mm gun. The guys are saying we can finally pay the bastards back. I hope to God they're right." Testing continued even as combat deployment began. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion conducted trials in December 1944, concluding that while the M36 90mm gun couldn't penetrate a Tiger II's frontal armor at any range with standard ammunition, it was tactically viable to engage Panthers from the side, and that engagement was something the old 3-inch gun couldn't reliably accomplish. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes forest. Artillery fire erupted along an 80-mile front as German forces launched Operation Walk am Rhein, the last great German offensive in the West. 3 armies, 200,000 men, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, came roaring out of the supposedly impassable Ardennes in a desperate gamble to split Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units, many green and untested, others exhausted from months of continuous combat, fell back in confusion. In the opening days, German Panzers, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers smashed through defensive positions. The 5th Panzer Army bypassed the town of Bastogne and by December 24 had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River. But something was different this time. Something the Germans hadn't accounted for in their planning. American tank destroyer battalions were transitioning to the M36. And those M36s were about to demonstrate exactly why the 90mm gun had been worth fighting for. December 20, 1944. Near Werbeumont, Belgium. M36 tank destroyers from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, moved forward through heavy fog to engage German armor attempting to break through to the Meuse. The crews were cold, exhausted, and facing elite SS Panzer divisions. But for the first time, they weren't outgunned. The first engagement came suddenly. A Panther appeared through the fog at approximately 1,200 yards, well beyond the effective range of standard American tank guns. The M36 commander, Lieutenant James Parker, didn't hesitate. "Target, tank, 1,200 yards, armor-piercing," he called. The gunner centered the reticle. The loader rammed an M82 round home. Up. The 90mm fired with a crack that split the morning air. The tracer arced across the snow-covered field. Impact. The Panther's turret ring exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The German tank slewed to a stop, its turret jammed, crew bailing out into the snow. First blood. But it was just the beginning. Throughout the battle, M36s demonstrated their worth repeatedly. Near Freihaldenhoven, an M36 from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged a King Tiger, the heaviest production tank of the war, at 1,000 yards. The American gunner aimed carefully for the side of the turret, the one location where the 90mm could penetrate the King Tiger's massive armor. The shot struck true. The King Tiger's ammunition detonated, and the 68-ton monster erupted in flames. Panthers were generally engaged at 1,500 yards, a range where the M36 90mm could reliably penetrate turret armor while remaining outside the effective range of German return fire. This standoff capability fundamentally changed the tactical dynamics. For the first time, American crews could engage heavy German armor from positions of relative safety rather than having to close to suicidal ranges. The 7th Armored Division employed its M36s at St. Vith, a critical road junction where American forces fought a desperate delaying action. Despite intense artillery shelling and the constant threat of infantry with Panzerfausts, the M36s held their positions and knocked out attacking Panthers and Tigers. The psychological impact on German tank crews was significant. For once, American armor could hurt them at range, and they couldn't simply advance with impunity. Lieutenant Alfred Rose's spectacular kill at 4,200 meters, more than 2.5 miles, became legendary among tank destroyer crews. Through his telescopic sight, Rose had spotted a Panther moving across a distant ridgeline. The shot required calculating bullet drop, wind drift, and the target's movement. It was as much art as science. The 90 mm roared. Seconds later, the Panther exploded. Crews who witnessed the shot claimed the round had to be seen to be believed. But the M36 wasn't invincible. Its armor remained thin, 1.25 inches on the turret sides, barely 1 inch on the hull sides. Any German tank gun could penetrate it easily. The open-top turret left crews vulnerable to artillery airbursts, and in the dense Ardennes forests, wood splinters from exploding shells proved almost as dangerous as the shells themselves. Crews improvised field modifications, welding additional armor plates to the turret sides and creating makeshift covers from salvaged metal plates. The doctrine of shoot and scoot became essential. M36 crews would position themselves in ambush, fire a few rounds, and immediately displace before German artillery could range them. Their speed and the 90 mm's long reach made this tactic viable. Static defense was suicide. Mobility was survival. Infantry units particularly praised the M36. Unlike tankers, infantry couldn't maneuver away from enemy armor. They had to stand their ground. Having M36s in support meant German panzers couldn't simply steamroll defensive positions. Infantrymen took comfort knowing they had firepower that could stand toe-to-toe with the German cats. The 90 mm's high-explosive rounds also proved valuable for bunker busting and fortification destruction. By January 1945, as the Bulge was compressed and German forces pushed back, battle damage assessments showed impressive results. M36s had accounted for dozens of confirmed Panthers and Tigers. Kill ratios had improved dramatically. It no longer took 5 American vehicles to kill 1 German heavy tank. One M36, properly positioned with a competent crew, could take on multiple targets. Production accelerated. By war's end in May 1945, approximately 2,324 minutes and 36 seconds of all variants had been manufactured. The M36 had largely replaced the M10 in tank destroyer battalions. Those units that received the new vehicle considered themselves fortunate, and they were. The difference in capability was night and day. German tank crews began avoiding engagements with M36s when possible, a remarkable reversal from the early days when Panthers could engage Shermans with near impunity. Captured German after-action reports noted the appearance of American vehicles with guns comparable to our 88 mm and recommended avoiding long-range duels. The psychological impact flowed both ways. American crews experienced a restoration of confidence. They were no longer sacrificial pawns. Technical Sergeant Robert Early, who fought in an M36 through the final months of the war, wrote, "When we got the 90 mm, it changed everything. Suddenly, we weren't just targets. We could fight back. We could win." That knowledge, that we had a weapon that worked, it was like someone lifted a weight off our chests. The famous duel in Cologne in March 1945, captured on film by a U.S. Signal Corps cameraman, showed an M26 Pershing, also mounting a 90 mm gun, stalking and destroying a Panther after the German tank had knocked out 2 Shermans. The footage became symbolic of American armor finally achieving parity with German heavy tanks. But for every Pershing, only a handful reached Europe before VE Day. There were dozens of M36s doing the same work. In the Korean War, the M36 proved it could defeat any Soviet-built tank deployed by North Korea, including the T-34-85. Its service continued for decades in armies around the world. Yugoslavia operated M36s into the 1990s, and they saw combat during the Balkan Wars. The 90 mm gun's fundamental design was so successful that variants served in American armored forces well into the Cold War. The weapon that was rejected, delayed, and nearly cancelled had saved countless lives and helped secure victory in the largest battle the U.S. Army would fight in the war. The story of the 90 mm gun isn't really about ballistics and armor penetration. It's about institutional failure, the cost of bureaucratic arrogance, and the courage of engineers and field commanders who refused to accept that American soldiers should die for doctrinal convenience. Let's be brutally honest about what happened. The United States possessed the industrial capacity, engineering expertise, and raw materials to develop and produce the 90mm gun years before it reached the battlefield. The weapon wasn't technologically radical. The Soviets, Germans, and British all developed comparable guns in similar time frames. The delays weren't about technical impossibility. They were about bureaucratic resistance, doctrinal rigidity, and the catastrophic consequences when military leadership becomes convinced of its own infallibility. General Leslie McNair believed tank destroyer doctrine represented the optimal solution to armored warfare. To his credit, the doctrine had logic behind it. Specialized anti-tank forces could concentrate firepower where needed while allowing tanks to focus on supporting infantry. But McNair became so invested in his doctrine that he interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. When field commanders reported the Sherman was inadequate against Panthers, McNair heard them saying the 76mm gun wasn't adequate, so he approved 76mm production. When they said even the 76mm struggled, he responded that HVAP ammunition would solve the problem. When HVAP proved scarce and still insufficient against frontal armor, he argued that proper tactics, flanking maneuvers, combined arms, would compensate. He was technically correct on the last point. Properly employed American armor, supported by air power and artillery, could defeat German heavy tanks through maneuver and concentration of force. But that cold tactical logic ignored the human cost. Every month of delay meant hundreds more tank crews burned alive in Shermans that couldn't fight back. Every rejected request for better weapons meant more desperate last stands, more traumatized survivors, more families receiving telegrams that their sons, husbands, and fathers weren't coming home. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers deserves recognition as the persistent voice arguing for better tanks. Devers understood that while doctrine mattered, weapons capability mattered more. He fought for the T-26/M26 Pershing. He requested 90mm armed vehicles. He went over McNair's head to General George Marshall. And when he was transferred to the Mediterranean in late 1943, conveniently removing him from the debate, he continued advocating for better armor from his new command. Marshall's December 1943 decision to override McNair and authorize 250 Pershings probably saved the program. But production delays meant only a handful reached Europe before Germany surrendered. The M36, already further along in development, became the practical solution. Not the ideal heavy tank with 90mm gun, but good enough and available in meaningful numbers by late 1944. The engineering teams deserve immense credit. Working against bureaucratic headwinds, they solved the technical challenges of mounting a heavy anti-aircraft gun in a mobile turret, balancing recoil forces, creating ammunition variants for different targets, and adapting the weapon for field service. The counterweight bustle design was particularly elegant, solving multiple problems with a single structural element. But let's consider the lessons for modern military acquisition and innovation. First, battle need criteria must include preventing future threats, not just addressing current ones. McNair's insistence that no battle need existed for 90mm armed vehicles was technically true in 1943, because the Panther hadn't appeared in significant numbers yet. But intelligence indicated it was coming. Waiting until after soldiers were dying to begin development guaranteed those soldiers would die while waiting for the solution. Second, institutional doctrine should guide tactics, not constrain technology. Tank destroyer doctrine could have incorporated 90mm guns without abandoning its fundamental principles. The resistance wasn't tactical, it was psychological. McNair and others had invested so much in their doctrine that acknowledging the need for better weapons felt like admitting failure. Third, listen to the people doing the fighting. Field commanders were sending desperate messages. Tank crews were begging for weapons that could fight back. The disconnect between battlefield reality and rear echelon perception nearly proved catastrophic. Modern militaries must maintain feedback channels that allow ground truth to influence acquisition decisions. Fourth, industrial capacity means nothing if bureaucracy prevents its use. America could have produced thousands of M36s in 1943. The factories existed. The materials were available. The engineering was solvable. But institutional resistance meant those capabilities sat idle while soldiers died with inadequate weapons. Fifth, innovation often requires individuals willing to risk their careers. Devers went over his commanding officer's head. Ordnance engineers continued working on the M36 even when told it wasn't needed. Crews in the field improvised modifications and developed tactics that headquarters hadn't authorized. Progress required people willing to be disobedient when obedience meant death. The 90mm gun's impact extended far beyond World War II. Its fundamental design influenced post-war tank development. The M26 Pershing, mounting the 90mm, became the basis for the M46, M47, and M48 Patton series of tanks that served throughout the Cold War. The gun's successful integration into tank destroyers proved the concept of mounting anti-aircraft weapons in armored vehicles, influencing future self-propelled anti-aircraft systems. The Korean War demonstrated the weapon's continued relevance. M36S and M26S faced Soviet-built T-34-85S and proved decisively superior. The 90mm could penetrate T-34 armor at any combat range, while the T-34's 85mm gun struggled to penetrate American frontal armor. Internationally, the M36 served in over 20 armies. The French used them in Indochina and Algeria. The Italians, Greeks, Turks, and Yugoslavs operated them for decades. Some remained in service into the 1990s, a remarkable lifespan for a weapon system rushed into production in 1944. This longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design. But perhaps the most important legacy is what the 90mm story teaches about military culture and reform. In his post-war memoirs, Omar Bradley, who served under McNair and shared many of his doctrinal views, acknowledged that American armor doctrine had been too inflexible. The Army's official history of World War II, written in the 1950s, concluded that the delay in fielding adequate anti-tank weapons had been a strategic error that cost lives unnecessarily. Those admissions matter. They represent institutional learning, the willingness to examine failures honestly. Modern American military doctrine emphasizes rapid prototyping, iterative development, and maintaining technological overmatch against potential adversaries. These principles directly address the failures that delayed the 90mm gun. The Defense Innovation Unit, established in 2015, exists specifically to bypass bureaucratic barriers that slow technology adoption. Rapid acquisition authorities allow the military to field new capabilities in months rather than years. These reforms wouldn't exist without the painful lessons of programs like the 90mm, lessons written in the blood of tankers who died waiting for weapons that could have been provided years earlier. There's a memorial at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, that honors the tank destroyer forces. It lists the battalions and their battle honors. When veterans gather there, some bring photographs of their M36S. They talk about the gun that saved their lives, the weapon that finally let them fight back. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as tales of triumph, but as testimony to what happens when institutions prioritize doctrine over reality. In the end, the 90mm gun succeeded not because the system worked, but because individuals, engineers, field commanders, and ultimately soldiers themselves, refused to accept institutional failure as inevitable. They fought for change. They demanded better. And eventually, bloodied and delayed but unbowed, they got it. The weapon that brass said wasn't needed ended up being exactly what was needed. The gun that was rejected proved itself indispensable. And the delay that cost so many lives taught lessons that would reshape how America develops and fields military technology. Today, when military acquisition professionals discuss reform, someone usually mentions the M36. Remember the 90mm, they say. It's become shorthand for the human cost of institutional resistance to innovation. As long as people remember that cost, remember the tank crews who died in Shermans that couldn't fight back, remember the desperate field commanders begging for weapons that already existed, remember the engineers who kept working despite being told their weapon wasn't needed, then those deaths weren't entirely in vain. The story of the 90mm gun is ultimately a story about courage. Not just the courage of the men who crewed the M36S and faced down panthers and tigers in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, but the courage to challenge institutional orthodoxy, to admit failure, to learn from mistakes, and to ensure that the next generation of soldiers doesn't pay the same price. That's a lesson worth remembering. That's a story worth telling. So before you go, I need you to do something. Hit that like button if this story made you think differently about military innovation and bureaucracy. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives into the human stories behind historical technology. And drop a comment telling me, what other weapons or innovations were delayed by bureaucracy when soldiers' lives hung in the balance? I read every comment, and your suggestions shape future videos. The men who crewed those M36s in December 1944 deserve to be remembered. Not just as statistics or military unit designations, but as human beings who went to war with inadequate weapons, who survived despite institutional failures, and who finally received the tool they needed to fight back. This is their story. And it's a story that still matters today, 7 decades later, because the tension between institutional inertia and battlefield necessity hasn't gone away. It never will. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why procurement matters, why acquisition reform matters, why listening to the people doing the fighting matters. Because somewhere, right now, soldiers are waiting for a capability they need. And whether they get it in time, or die waiting, depends on whether we've learned the lessons the 90mm tried to teach us. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.